All right, well, good evening, everyone. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Ronan O'Malley, and I'm with the World Affairs Council. I'm delighted to have you all here tonight. Also, before we start, obviously, I'd like to, acknowledge and thank if there are any former or current military members here. It is Veterans Day, so thank you all for your service. And also, Ambassador Jeffrey probably doesn't want me to say it, but I'd also like to thank and acknowledge his service. In addition to serving multiple years in Iraq within both the Bush administration and the Obama administration, difficult years obviously with the violence occurring there in Iraq, he also served 7 years, I believe, as an infantry officer in the Army stationed in Germany and in Vietnam towards the end of the war. So thank you for your service as well. Thank you. So now I'd like to basically move on to the biographies of both of our panelists tonight. Ambassador James Jeffrey is the former U.S. ambassador to Iraq, Turkey, and Albania. He's currently the Philip Solondz Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute, where he focuses on U.S. regional diplomatic and military strategy, as well as strategy related to Iran, Iraq, and Turkey. Jeffrey served as assistant to the president and deputy national security advisor in the George Bush administration, with a particular focus on Iran. And our other panelist is Jonathan Schauser, PhD. He's the vice president for research at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Previously, he was a terrorism finance analyst for the U.S. Department of Treasury. Schauser is a former research fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He is also the author of numerous acclaimed books relating to Israel, Palestine, and the broader Middle East, including a book you should look up if you're interested in the area, State of Failure, Yasser Arafat, Mahmoud Abbas, and the Unmaking of the Palestinian State. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Jeffrey and Jonathan Schauser. I was going to let each of them give just a brief kind of opening comments. Basically, and we'll get into more depth from that. Each of you related to maybe how it was that you became so involved with regards to issues related to Iran. And then basically, if you want to kind of take it from there, Ambassador, if you want to maybe kind of reference how you think Obama and the administration decided to pursue this deal and why they did it and your perspective on it. And then, Jonathan Schauser, something similar with regards to the Israeli perspective and how it was received and perceived in Israel. And Ambassador, do you want to start first?
Thank you very much for having us here tonight. I'd like to thank the World Affairs Council, Mr. O'Malley, and all of you for putting this together. We're glad we have such an enthusiastic audience on Veterans Day. It's appropriate on a day like this that we do talk about serious issues of war and peace, because while America's role in the world is unique and very positive in its impact, it's also unique in how we do it. We honor, as we should, the military. And at the end of the day, the president is the person who decides foreign policy. But in our country, this is done only with the will of the people, and the only way the people can exercise that will is to stay informed. So again, I'm delighted to see so many of you here tonight. My background with Iran, basically you've heard some of my jobs. Many of them have been in or around Iran. I was a deputy national security advisor in the late Bush administration, and Iran was one of our top issues, and I'll get to that. And I spent 3 years in Iraq with Iranian militias on Iranian orders trying to kill me and my people, so I have a lot of personal involvement with the Iranians, but I'll try to be as objective as I can on this issue. As they say, foreign great powers do not have permanent enemies, they have permanent interests. Well, one of our interests is to deal with the Iranian challenge. And I'll give a brief summary of what I think is going on with this agreement, but focus more on the regional and political implications of it, because I think they're more important. First of all, this isn't true arms control as the arms control experts would imagine it. We secured a much better, in that sense, arms control agreement with North Korea, briefly, before they violated it, at the end of the Bush administration. And we had better arms control agreements with the Iraqis in the 1990s that required really getting rid of all of your infrastructure. That's classic arms control. What we have with this agreement is essentially arms management. That is, the Iranians keep most of their infrastructure, but it is under heightened control. So what exactly do they get rid of? What do they change? First of all, one thing that is real arms control is they get rid of their plutonium reactor at Iraq. They replace it with a less threatening reactor that will use a different kind of feed material and will not be capable of producing plutonium. So that is a little bit of real arms control and disarmament, but that's basically peripheral to their primary program, which was moving to a weapon, and there's no doubt that they were trying to move to a weapon, or at least keeping that option open. I have no doubt of that from all the intelligence I've seen and a lot of other things, through enrichment of uranium. Basically, the agreement, by limiting the kind of centrifuges they will have for enriching uranium and the number of centrifuges for a period of 10 years with some limitations beyond then, and then by eliminating most of the supplies of low enriched uranium from roughly 10,000 kilos down to 300 kilos, it pushes the Iranians back, we think, from their current level of 2 to 3 months before they would get a critical mass of uranium, highly enriched 90+%, to produce one nuclear device, back to almost a year. And that's even better than they were before the end of 2013, when we had the interim agreement. They had 20% enriched uranium, so they were even closer than 2 to 3 months. So that's the main plus of this agreement. It doesn't change Iran's basic infrastructure. They essentially put their centrifuges in mothballs. They don't destroy anything other than the Iraq plutonium site. In return, all of the international sanctions on Iran are lifted almost immediately, except for the American ones, which are suspended, and then eventually the American ones are supposed to be lifted as well. And after 10 years, Iran basically gets a pass from the international community in the UN Security Council resolution, because that ends after 10 years, and essentially a bill of good health from this agreement in the implementing UN resolution. So those are the elements of the deal. In addition, Iran, there are provisions to allow, they're unique, but they haven't been tested, reimposition of sanctions if Iran is cheating, and there is a very intrusive but also, under certain circumstances, challengeable inspection regime to be carried out by the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA. Okay, the political context is much more important. When you look at other countries that have tried to get nuclear weapons, they fall into two categories: South Korea, Israel, although that's not confirmed, India, Pakistan. Whether they wound up getting the weapons or not, those weapons were seen primarily as defensive in nature. Those countries didn't have an agenda for dominance of an entire region. They weren't aggressive, they weren't rogue states. And so the international community approached them in one way. With a set of other states, Iraq, Iran, Syria, Libya, and North Korea, the combination of their rogue state status, Libya and North Korea, and their regional hegemonial ambitions, Iran, Iraq, to some degree Syria, made it imperative that, in their willingness in the case of Syria and Iraq to use weapons of mass destruction on their own people, made it imperative for the international community to act decisively. And that's what brought us to this negotiation, which has been going on for a decade or more. There's a second political context to this. The first one requires us to put this agreement into the overall context of Iran's role in the region, which is not a very good role, and it's gotten worse, frankly, since the agreement came about. The second political context is the Obama administration's approach. While this has been denied many times, I've heard the Vice President, who I like and trust, say it. I've heard other officials almost as high confirm it to me, but nonetheless, that this is not so. I believe the following. The administration hoped that, rather like its outreach to Cuba, that outreach to Iran, showing trust, negotiating in good faith, would produce a transformation in the leadership and in the people. You remember all of those pictures when the agreement was signed of cool kids in Tehran driving around beeping their horns and such. And the administration had a lot of hope that it could help transform the region because of this. We'll get into that more in a moment. That's not the official argument. The official argument is this is a transactional agreement. They do X, we do Y. But I think that that was one of the factors that propelled the administration to take some of the decisions they took. We'll see how well this is working out in a second. Okay, what are the problems with this agreement? Very briefly, because that could take hours to go through, it's a goofy set of agreements. There are 4 of them. There is a guidelines, a roadmap that the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, has signed with Iran to work on what's called the prior military dimension, possible military dimensions, PMD, the fact that Iran was working on weaponizing this a nuclear device through warheads and charges to set off the thing, and we have very good intelligence on that, but the IAEA is supposed to complete an investigation of that. Then there's the agreement itself. Then there's a UN resolution, 2231, and then there is a strange annex to it, Annex B, which was signed by the P5+1. Those are the people who negotiated. The 5 permanent members of the Security Council, China, Russia, America, Britain, and France, plus Germany, plus the EU got on this thing, negotiated among themselves their own agreement, sort of shared it with the Iranians, but the Iranians haven't signed up for it, for a whole series of other things. Going through this thing, as I had to do before presenting myself before you, is like going through the Internal Revenue Service income tax regulations. It's very, very complicated, and it opens up a lot of area for question. Okay, that's the first problem. Very specific ones. There are implications for arms control because the agreement in its various forms uses the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, which Iran and almost everybody else in the world has signed, and the IAEA, this organization that enforces it, to support provisions of the agreement. But these organizations and that treaty are not specifically part of the negotiations or, in some cases, the decisions formed. So that's an area for possible friction. Where are these frictions points going to come out? First of all, on the 15th of December, the IAEA has to give a final report on the possible military dimensions. If that report is honest and is well researched, it will conclude that Iran had a military weaponization program. What effect will that have on the rollout of this treaty and the decisions we're going to make? We don't know, but that's an important point. Will the administration, which sits on the board of the IAEA, try to cook the data? I don't know. Next, the IAEA has to report that Iran has taken the preliminary steps on getting rid of most of its stockpile, on closing down most of its centrifuges, and on removing the core of the Iraq plutonium plant. In order for the sanctions lifting process to begin, no sanctions have been lifted as yet. It has to wait until that happens. We don't know if the Iranians will delay, if the IAEA will have disagreements. So that's the next problem. Third problem is there is a point where the IAEA is to give a final or a broader conclusion, which is a determination that Iran has no infrastructure or programs to try to weaponize a nuclear device. And it will take years for the IAEA to do that. But under this agreement, by year 8, whether it does it or not, there are further steps that the rest of us are supposed to take, including in the United States, actually ending the sanctions, which will require a vote by Congress. So that will be a problem. And then finally, after 10 years, this resolution goes away. Yet many of the requirements that Iran has signed up to will remain, many of them for 5 more years to year 15, some of them to year 20, a few to year 25. And nobody knows how that's going to work. So those are the basic problems within the agreement. There are also items that have come up that I call the political side of this agreement that people refer to all the time, and with good reason. Enrichment is not prohibited in this agreement. It's limited, but it's not prohibited. And after 10 years, the limitations begin to fall off. They're essentially all but over by year 15. The Iranians get a lot of money. This isn't money that somehow the international community gives to them. It's only fair to note, much as I have problems with the Iranians, that this is money that they earned selling their oil, but has been frozen because of the sanctions. That's somewhere usable between 50 and upwards to $100 billion. Nobody knows how much, and nobody can contest, or nobody can state with certainty what the Iranians are going to do with it, but given the mischief they're making around the region, it's a fair guess that some of it's going to go to supporting their surrogates. The agreement doesn't touch on Iran's role in supporting terror groups, money laundering, their own despicable human rights, internal human rights record, or detentions of Americans, and people raise that. And there's nothing in this agreement or the UN resolution that basically accuses Iran of violating the NPT, which it clearly has done in all kinds of ways. And that could be the subject of an entire discussion for a couple of hours of all the things they've done to violate the NPT. And that's troubling from a political standpoint. Now, and we can get into this in the discussion, but a preliminary answer to, well, why didn't the agreement do that? The reason is, and I was around when this happened in the George Bush administration, the Bush administration took a decision not to use military force against Iran because of its nuclear program, and rather to turn it over to the international community. To some degree the UN, and particularly to this group of negotiators, which is synonymous with the permanent members of the Security Council. Once you did that and invited in these actors in these institutions, you have to adhere to a different set of rules. Many of you are either business people or in law, and you know that when you have a legal problem, you have a whole variety of options. You can do it in a criminal court, you can do it in a civil court, you can do it through arbitration, you can do it through various things. But whatever you choose, you're then sort of committed to that. And you're committed to the special rules of that. Well, again, without getting into the details, the UN is not a good institution to point the finger at any of its member states, particularly third world member states like Iran, and so it would have been very difficult to get these issues in there. Finally, there's a wider political context. Since this agreement has been signed, and the preliminary steps are actually underway in Iran and at the UN and around the world, you hear almost nothing about it. It's basically disappeared from the scopes. And the reason why is that it's still controversial under the surface, but right now we have so many problems with Iran, in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, and now with a new friend, Putin's Russia, intervening as their ally, that all of the attention is focusing on that. What little is left is focused on ISIS, which is part of the problem. So this whole dream that Iran perhaps would become a force for stability, I think is fading even in the minds of the administration. But we'll see. The next thing is, of course, you will have a new administration. By the time this thing comes into full effect and we start suspending our sanctions, we'll be halfway through 2016. In a few months, we'll have a new administration, which clearly will have a different view towards this. In the end, however, we will have to be confronting Iran throughout the region because of the things it does, while simultaneously trying to uphold a very complicated agreement. One example, the Iranians contest our ability to restrict, under these agreements, or the old agreements, their ability to develop ballistic missiles or to buy, and particularly to transfer conventional weapons. Another problem is that we have to watch. We have sanctions on Iran that are not related to the nuclear program. Rather, they're related to terrorism, they're related to human rights, they're related to money laundering, and a number of other things. The Iranians expect that all of these sanctions will be lifted. The president and the administration, and certainly the next administration, is in no mood to do that. So there are a number of conflicts built right into this thing. So you're going to hear more about this agreement in the future. Thank you very much.
Just, I think our mics are, can you guys hear me now? Yeah. Okay, yeah, so we're just going to move on to Jonathan Schanzer, and I think his mic is working now as well, so we apologize for that. What's funny is we normally have no problems with mics, but the last time we did an Iran program, we had problems as well. So I don't know if that's a divine perspective or intervention or what. But I'd like to move on to Jonathan Schanzer.
Okay, well, thank you, Ronan, and pleasure to be with you, Ambassador Jeffrey, and pleasure to be with all of you here in Houston tonight. I just by a quick way of background, I had the opportunity of studying in Israel for 2.5 years, where I studied terrorism and Middle Eastern history, and based on that experience, Ronan asked me if I would come to talk about the Israeli perspective. Since studying at Hebrew University, I've gone on to work at a number of different think tanks, as well as at the U.S. Treasury, where I used to track terror finance for a living for several years. Over the last 6 years, I've been working for an organization called Foundation for Defense of Democracies. We deal with a wide range of issues across the Middle East and terrorism, but a main focus of ours has been on the Iran deal, trying to find ways to either sanction Iran or to get a better deal that was being negotiated by the administration over these last several years. From the Israeli perspective, in one of my first days in class, I had a professor make a joke which has always resonated with me ever since. He said, if you ever want to understand how the Israelis view the rest of the Middle East, you just need to understand it through this one joke. That the story goes, if everybody knows their biblical history, that Moses was deaf. And when God told him to go to Canada, he heard Canaan, and the rest was history. It's a tough neighborhood. The Israelis are in a fight for their survival. They wish they were in Canada. They're in the Middle East. And we have always understood Israel's plight here in this country, that the organizations and countries that they have deemed to be terrorists are the same ones that we have deemed to be terrorists here. As a matter of fact, in the Iranian case, in the United States, we're called the Great Satan, and the Israelis are called the Little Satan. So I guess we were a step up on them in that regard. But we're in the same boat, and their Western values are our Western values, and this has been the way that we have conducted our foreign policy in the Middle East. And so when we began to hear inklings of an Iran deal in the works, the Israelis began to get nervous. They began to hear that Iran's changes politically, that it was becoming more of a moderate country, and that this was a country that we could deal with. Of course, they are aware of the fact that the United States had become rather war-weary after the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan. We had lost enough blood and treasure that the last thing we wanted to do was to get into another war here in this country. The Israelis didn't really feel like they had that luxury. The Israelis feel that they have to fight the fights that need fighting when they're called upon to do so. And as it happens, Iran was calling for Israel to be wiped off the map, calling for Israel's destruction. And so the Israelis did ultimately believe that they were going to likely have a showdown with the Iranians, and they wanted us on their side. What we saw with the beginning of the Obama administration was an attempt by this administration to negotiate. We heard the president during his inaugural speech talk about his outstretched hand to Iran, this desire to negotiate with Iran based on mutual respect. The Israelis didn't think that was possible, but went along with it. And ultimately, when Iran slapped that outstretched hand, we engaged in sanctions against Iran. As it began to develop that nuclear program, threatening Israel, threatening to wipe it off the map, we started imposing sanctions here in this country. The Treasury Department that I worked for began it, where we were hurting the Iranians significantly, financially, going after their oil, going after petrochemicals, automobiles. I mean, just about every financial sector we could go after, we did. I don't know the word for uncle in Farsi, but that's what we were trying to get the Iranians to say. We wanted them to say uncle. And the Israelis were cooperating with us on that, trying to come up with interesting ideas, other ways to squeeze the Iranians, to ultimately get them to relinquish that nuclear program and get back to the table. Now, it was somewhere around 2013 that I had a visit from some Israeli friends who told me that in this race between U.S. economic pressure and Iranian nuclear physics, that we had pretty much reached a tie. That there was no way of knowing who was going to win this race, but that the Iranians were not backing down. And so it was a question of whether we'd be able to bankrupt them in time. And I think ultimately the administration decided that this was a risk they weren't willing to take. And that's when they reached out to the Iranians and negotiated what's now known as the Joint Plan of Action. This was an interim agreement signed in November 2013 that put us on the path to a final status talks. And what the Israelis heard, what we heard here in America time and again, was that no deal is better than a bad deal. That there's no way that the United States was going to negotiate a bad deal. And this was the one thing that the Israelis kept coming back to all of us in Washington saying, are you sure it's not going to be a bad deal? Are you sure it's not going to be a bad deal? Because these guys are dangerous. They support Hamas. They support Hezbollah. They support jihadis in Iraq and Afghanistan. They've killed Americans. They've killed Israelis. The last thing we want to do is to see these guys benefit from an agreement or ultimately, God forbid, get that nuclear weapon. And so you fast forward to July, and it turns out that a bad deal was better than no deal, at least in the eyes of the Israelis. In my perspective, too, I believe that this deal is deeply flawed. The Israelis point to 5 numbers as to why this is a bad deal. The first number is $120 billion. Now, Ambassador Jeffrey said that he wasn't sure about the exact number in sanctions relief. According to Rubini Global Economics, an economics firm that we work with, we can now say with relative certainty that it is more than $100 billion in sanctions relief we're giving to the Iranians, likely $120 billion. That is a lot of money. And it's a lot of money that's going to go to the hands of Hezbollah and Hamas and other terrorist groups that are dedicated to destroying Israel. So that's the first number. The second number is 5. In 5 years, the arms embargo on Iran will be lifted according to the terms of this deal. This means that Iran's military will be able to grow. Iran will be able to export hardware to other enemies of the United States and Israel everywhere around the world. And so you're going to see Iran's military capacity grow. Then the next number is 8. In 8 years, you will see the lifting of the ballistic missile ban on Iran. This is ballistic missiles for the delivery of what? Likely a nuclear weapon. What do they need ballistic missiles for? We have somehow agreed to this in our negotiations. And then the fourth number is 15. And that is 15 years from now, we will see all of the sanctions lift. Iran will be able to go right back to enriching uranium and developing that nuclear program that we said we were going to stop. In other words, what we've done is we've kicked the can down the road for 15 years, making the Middle East that much more dangerous 15 years from now. The last number I'll point to is 1. That's the number of nuclear weapons it would take to destroy Israel. Israel is smaller than the state of New Jersey. They are keenly aware of their strategic challenge in this regard. And so if Iran, 15 years from now, 20 years from now, is able to make that dash for a bomb, and that we have allowed for it in this agreement, the Israelis think this is an unforced error, to say the least. And so this is the reason why you hear the Israelis talking about the flawed deal. It's the reason why you had the Prime Minister of Israel coming and speaking before a joint session of Congress despite the protests of President Obama. The Israelis think this is a very flawed deal. And I will tell you this, that it is not just an Israeli problem. It is an American problem too. That Iran is a danger to the United States and to all of our allies around the region. And the Israelis are wondering, how is it that this White House didn't get it? Thank you very much.
And just for the sake of time, I'm going to try and ask relatively short questions, and I know it's not easy to give short answers, a lot of these questions. Obviously, 2020 is easy, but would either of you be in the perspective that perhaps no deal should be done at all with this regime, because it's a regime you can't trust, or perhaps that you would do some sort of deal but be very different, and how would you want it structured? I don't know. Either of you wants to go first.
Yeah. The best outcome would have been to continue these sanctions on Iran, because they were really, as you just heard, really hurting Iran. I don't think that would be possible, however, and the reason is, totally apart from the fact that the Obama administration, and here we totally agree, had their own transformational ideas. The problem is, once we went into this UN permanent 5+1 structure, many of the things that concern us about Iran, we really couldn't bring to the table. I'm actually surprised that the Russians in particular went along with the limited restrictions on ballistic missiles and weapons, because they're outside, particularly the conventional weapons, of the context of a nuclear agreement per se. And it's interesting that the Iranians didn't agree to that. That is done in this side annex, and the Iranians have already started violating the old agreements, because there were sanctions on that under the latest of the series of UN Security Council resolutions. I think that the UN system, leaving apart the pernicious attitudes of the Chinese and the Russians, who are our partners in this thing, the UN system is sort of like the Catholic Church. It assumes that all of its members are capable of reform. It can't basically say, you are a bad actor, look at all of the bad statements you say, because if it did that, 2/3 of the member states would at one or another point be thrown out for their really atrocious behavior. It's not a particularly nice club. So that's the first problem. The second problem is the reason the sanctions bit Iran is not our sanctions directly, because the Iranians could have found other places to sell their oil, and they did, because we've cut off oil purchases from Iran for many years, and they could find, although that's more difficult, other places to do their banking and their other business. What we were able to do, but only by doing it within the context of this multilateral vehicle, was to get the rest of the world to cut off, or at least reduce, oil purchases from Iran, and to cooperate with us in denying Iran's banks access to the international system. But that came at a cost. The cost was the rest of the world wanted us to negotiate what is more or less a traditional nuclear agreement. I think we could have gotten a better variant of this if we had been tougher and pushed back to our friends and allies, and not so friends, the Russians and Chinese. But sooner or later, they would have not allowed us to keep this system going on indefinitely. It wasn't in Russia and China's national interest, and it isn't in the ethos of the international system to basically have a perennial pariah. It just isn't.
Look, I think that this deal was not negotiated well, to say the least. That I think the red lines that the United States had on this deal were ultimately eroded, and this administration collapsed on many of the key issues. I think probably, look, I mean, we could go back and take a look at the regional behavior of Iran and why that was not even part of the deal to begin with. This is something that's very troubling to me, that we have essentially decided to give the Iranians $120 billion and all these other perks, and they have not promised to stop sponsoring terrorism. They have not promised to stop violating the human rights of their own people. They have not promised to stop providing Bashar al-Assad in Syria with money and weapons as he barrel bombs his own people, killing 250,000 people over the last 4 years. The fact that we never asked for all of this, and by the way, we never asked for the release of our personnel who are currently being held in Iranian prisons for no reason. Right? I mean, we lost all leverage. We've given them everything they want, and we've gotten virtually nothing in return. Now, one could say, well, that at least we're kicking the can down the road on the nukes. That what we're doing is we're buying ourselves time to perhaps negotiate a better deal with the Iranians, but I don't see this administration interested in that whatsoever. It will come to the next president if the next president is up to the task. But the real worry that I have is that we're leaving most of the infrastructure in place. That Iran, when it chooses to, depending on whether the sanctions end or whether they make a dash for a bomb, they will be able to dust off the infrastructure that they have and begin to enrich uranium yet again. The centrifuges will spin yet again. They have the know-how. We didn't dismantle the Iranian nuclear program. We put it on ice. And so we didn't get anything in terms of what we wanted. And it's for that reason that we continue to see our allies very unhappy about this in the region, and our enemies are celebrating it. And that should speak volumes.
And just before we delve into the heart of the talk, which is really the impact on the U.S., Israel, and the broader region, with regards to the other members of the P5+1, you know, Germany, UK, and France, perhaps it's easier to figure out their perspective if it's economic or whatnot. The Chinese, obviously, if Iran opens up more, hopefully oil for them gets cheaper. They like that. They have another market to sell to. Russia perhaps is a tougher one to understand. Obviously, Russia doesn't want any more oil coming on the market. I don't necessarily know that Putin would like the idea of the U.S. kind of getting stronger ties with Iran. How much input do Russia have in the deal, and why do you think they went along with it?
Well, everybody had input to the deal because that's the way these things work. But this is where we have a disagreement up here to some degree. The lowest common denominator, once again, believe me, we had a choice, and this wasn't Obama's choice, this was George Bush's choice, and I was there when he made it. We could do this unilaterally, and that would have been one or another form of war or naval blockade that would have led to military, or we could go to the international community and say, let's come up with a sanctions regime that the rest of the world will join with us, because it's worthless for us to sanction Iran. We've been sanctioning Iran for years. If the rest of the world participates in that thing. But the rest of the world has a price. The lowest common denominator is that we stick to a nuclear agreement. Because the one thing that everybody has in common is nobody wanted Iran to get a nuclear weapon, and they wanted to pull Iran back from that to a certain degree. The Iranians said, we're only going to go back so far, and this enrichment that you want us to stop, and the initial UN resolutions basically called on a ceasing of enrichment, the Iranians said, quite properly, we're members of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. There is no prohibition on enrichment. The only way, and they didn't say that, but it's the answer to it, when a country is violating the NPT, which Iran was doing, then you can, through Security Council resolutions, order it under legal procedures to stop enriching, which Iran violated, but you can at least do that. But the idea of a permanent block to enrichment was not something that I don't think was ever in the cards. Furthermore, there's no way we could have gotten these other countries to sign on to what they would see, particularly China and Russia. I mean, look at China. There's no way, or look at Russia. There's no way Russia, that's out there fighting right now with Iran in Syria to keep Bashar al-Assad in power. There's no way they would agree to this list of political ideas. I support 100% the intent of trying to get Iran to stop those things, but we can't get the international community to get Iran to stop those things. We want to stop them, we do it ourselves. We do it with bayonets.
Okay. And maybe just to move on to Israel specifically, obviously in all the time leading up to the deal, politically, I mean, first of all, I think general public opinion in Israel, understandably, most people were against the deal. I think most major political figures and parties were against it. Is that how you see it? And then also you hear some people say that actually maybe within the Israeli intelligence community there were different perspectives on where Iran really is and where they're perhaps going. Could you comment on that?
Absolutely. Look, within Israeli society there was broad disapproval of the deal. And within Israel, I mean, you have to understand that you put two Israelis in a room and you typically get about 7 different opinions. And so the idea that they would be in broad agreement that this was a bad deal was significant. And even within the Knesset, Israel's parliament, you saw that the Defense and Foreign Affairs Committee, that 30 out of 33 people disapproved of the deal, saying that it was dangerous for Israel in the long term. Now, you did have some individuals from within the intelligence community say that it wasn't necessarily a bad thing. There's a former Mossad director by the name of Meir Dagan. He's the most recent guy to step down from this position, and he's come out very publicly challenging Netanyahu over this deal. Now, the two of them have a good bit of history going back, so it's hard to know how much of this is personal as they sort of try to needle each other a little bit. But I can say this, that the Israeli intelligence establishment, the defense establishment, try to look at, I mean, they don't really have the ability to look long term at 15, 20 years. They think about 5 years at a time. I mean, again, this gets back to this idea of Israel being such a tough neighborhood, that because they're constantly facing threats, whether it's Hamas or Hezbollah or Al-Qaeda or now ISIS and all of these other different rogue regimes that have been threatening Israel, waging war against Israel over the years, the intelligence establishment now understands that they can't think that far in advance. They have to think about 5 years at a time, maybe 10 years if they're lucky. And so they look at this deal and they say, okay, you don't have to worry about getting nuked by Iran for 10 years. Sign me up. And that's why you saw at least some within the Israeli defense establishment embrace this. But again, if you talk to the average Israeli and really even a lot of the decision makers, there is deep discomfort. And I'll just add this, that it's also discomfort about the direction of America. That there is a sense, and it's not just the Israelis, it's the Saudis, it's the Turks, it's the Qataris, all the Gulf allies that we have in the region as well. They're wondering whether America is still ready to lead. That we collapsed on this deal and that we bent over for the Iranians and we gave them just about everything that they wanted, and that we seemed afraid of confrontation. And this, when Israel thinks about the United States as its strongest ally, its most important ally, and again, for the Saudis and all these other countries as well, there is deep concern about that too.
Okay, and just a follow-up on the Israeli politics. Obviously, Prime Minister Netanyahu's visit in the spring at the invitation of John Boehner and the Republicans to Congress created a lot of friction that was already there, but kind of emphasized it between the administration and Netanyahu's. Do you think that was done more so from the perspective of Netanyahu just ardently trying to make the case to the broader American public of his thoughts on the dangers of this deal, or do you think it was more of a political move for the domestic audience back home with I think the elections were coming the next 2 to 3 weeks?
Look, I think there were three different issues at play here. One was the personal dynamic between President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu, and they do not like each other. Let's just be very clear about that. They had some nice smiles over the last couple of days, and that's good to see, but there is some bad blood between them. They're like oil and water. They've just not been able to hit it off. And so, what started as a policy disagreement ultimately, I think, spilled over into something that looked more and more like a personal disagreement. I think that's number one. Number two, there were elections looming, and I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu understood that this was going to be good airtime for him, as any politician would. But I would also say this, that there was no one else who was going to make that speech in the world. That it was the job of the Israeli Prime Minister, if he saw this deal as dangerous, if he saw this deal as imperiling Israel long term, there was no one here in America who was going to get up and get that kind of audience. They were not going to be able to demand that they be able to stand in front of a joint session of Congress. Only the Prime Minister of Israel, the spokesperson for his people, had the credibility to do so. And so he took advantage of it, as I think just about any prime minister would in Israeli history. Okay,
and Ambassador, just to kind of move on to the broader region, obviously the Saudis and the Gulf states probably were not terribly happy with the deal, but in reality they maybe didn't do that much vocally. King Solomon, the new king, I think didn't come to the Camp David meeting that Obama had with other Gulf state leaders. What do you think the perspective on the Saudis and the Gulf states is? Did the administration kind of say, in return, we'll turn a blind eye and other things such as perhaps your escalating campaign in Yemen, or why is it that they at least seem to go along with the deal when obviously it doesn't seem like it's one that they would openly support?
Yeah, again, it's hard to separate out the deal in the larger context of the Obama administration's approach to Iran. There's deep suspicion of that approach. What happened was a very complicated process, and one act in this drama was Bibi Netanyahu coming to the United States. Another one was the Obama administration threw a party at Camp David, and 4 of the 6 Gulf leaders didn't come. A very strong indication that there was something, by all of our allies in the region, there was something radically wrong with our position on Iran, and this had crystallized with this agreement. The Israelis have very specific, and for good reasons, concerns about the agreement per se. I think with the other allies and partners, it was more a feeling that this was symptomatic of an administration that would not stand up to Iran, not in Afghanistan, where at the time the president said he would withdraw all of his forces, not in Iraq, where the president had withdrawn all of his forces at the end of 2011. I mean, there's a long history to that, but the point is it happened. And Iran was one of the contributing factors to the situation in Iraq that led to the alienation of the Sunni Arabs in the West and the rise of ISIS. And so there's that problem. Then there's a terrible problem in Syria that Iran is behind, and there was a budding problem in Yemen. What the administration seems to be doing since then, with some success, at least superficially, is trying in baby steps to rectify this. support for the Saudi campaign in Yemen, which is vaguely against Iran, small steps in Syria, a lot more fighter planes now operating out of Turkey and the 50 special forces on the ground, a few tweaks in Iraq, and keeping troops on after 2016 in Afghanistan. For the Obama administration, these are big steps. For the region, they're small steps, but they're a slight turning of the ship, and that's appreciated. But the more important thing is everybody knows that in a little over a year, you're not going to have this administration. So everybody has to figure out how are we going to deal with the next administration, and that's a very complicated game that's in play right now.
Okay, and just a follow-up, obviously another major player in the region, and Turkey, where you are also an ambassador. Why is it that, again, Turkey did not make too much of a fuss about this deal? Was it, again, kind of the idea that the U.S. and Turkey would kind of at least come to a loose gentleman's agreement that, Erdogan is increasingly kind of becoming increasingly autocratic and maybe recently getting, kind of harsher in his crackdown on the Kurds? What do you think was the Turks' perspective on it, and why do you think they didn't create more of a stink?
That's a complicated question. Turkey and its predecessor, the Ottoman Empire, and Iran and one of its predecessors, the Safavid Empire, have been rivals and enemies for hundreds and hundreds of years. But there's a sense of self-confidence in Turkey that actually sort of mirrors Iran's self-confidence, because both of these countries are nation states in the classic sense, that the Arabs don't have because they're not a nation state or a set of nation states the way other countries are, and they're inherently insecure. So the Turks are more secure about this. They also are under the NATO atomic umbrella with various classified NATO decisions that make it very clear that they're under the NATO umbrella. And so they don't find the nuclear issue as compelling as others do. But they do find Iran's behavior in the region, particularly in Syria, a national security threat to them. It's national security threat number one. And they're very unhappy with the Obama administration's treatment of that. But the president will have the chance to chat, at least on the margins, with Erdogan in this meeting next week, and this will be subject number one.
Okay. And did you want to say something as well?
Yeah, just one other thing is I think Turkey looks at this deal as a way to cash in. Look, I think Ambassador Jeffrey is absolutely right that we are seeing a Turkey that's very unhappy about Iran's meddling in the region, particularly in Syria. This is their big area of disagreement. But during the last 4 years, we have seen two major scandals erupt inside Turkey, and they haven't gotten a lot of press here in the U.S. But there was something called the Gas for Gold scheme, where the Turks, NATO ally, strong ally of the United States at the height of the sanctions regime, right? While we're imposing these tough sanctions on Iran, turns out that they were engaging in sanctions busting with Iran. That they were giving Iran $20 billion in gold in exchange for oil. And they were doing it off the books. They were doing it in ways that were technically legal according to sanctions, but obviously violated the spirit of everything that we were trying to do. And so you have this track record. This is one example. And then there was another where there was an Istanbul prosecutor's report that was leaked. It was roughly about 1.5 years ago. And during that episode, we learned that there was another $100 billion in illicit financial transactions going back and forth between Turkey and Iran. And a lot of those transactions were lining the pockets of Turkish leaders. And so what we have is a Turkey that is very unhappy about Iran's activities, but is seeing dollar signs. And now you've got $120 billion set to be injected into Iran's economy, and Turkey thinks it's going to cash in again.
Okay, and moving just again to Israel, and basically Israel obviously has a wide array of options still on the table. How viable and strong do you think the option is, or the potential of having actual airstrikes on Iranian components? The fact that they're in multiple facilities and maybe more spread out than say Saddam's facilities were back when the Israelis did it before. How realistic do you think that option is?
I don't think it's actually a realistic option. I mean, look, Israel has a very capable, very strong regional power of an air force, but it is not It's not a world power. It's not like the United States. It's not like Russia. It doesn't have the ability to command that kind of operation. And, you know, I've been briefed on what it would look like, the sort of traditional capabilities where you're talking about scrambling 100 jets over hostile airspace. You got to somehow identify friend or foe codes to fly over these countries. You got to refuel your jets midair, and again, you're talking about probably 100 of them, doing that a couple of times on your way to Iran. Once you get to Iran, you've got to evade the surface-to-air missiles, some advanced weaponry that the Russians have provided them. You need to hit multiple targets multiple times because some of these targets are embedded deep inside of a mountain, and the Israelis don't have a lot of the toys that they don't have the stealth bombers, they don't have the JDAMs and bunker busters and Moabs and all these other weaponry that we would be able to use were the United States carrying out this attack. So when I hear about the conventional strike, I have to doubt it. And I think a couple of things. One is that, you know, every time we think that Israel is going to do something, it usually doesn't. Israel has made a history of surprise attacks that have really taken its enemies and put them on their heels. So the one thing that I keep thinking about is, where is Israel a global superpower? And there's only one area, and that's in the area of technology. This is how Israel has grown over the last several decades. And so my theory, and I can't prove it, but my theory is that we've seen some of Israel's weapons developed. There was something called the Stuxnet virus that the Israelis deployed that ultimately took a number of centrifuges offline in Iran's nuclear facilities. There was another virus that was deployed shortly after that, also believed to be Israeli, called the Olympic Games virus. My theory is that Israel is coming up with another way of waging war. And it's quite possible that if it comes down to conflict with Iran, Israel might be able to win that war without firing a shot.
Okay, interesting. And just maybe one more question before we move on to the audience's questions. Ambassador, obviously, I'm not expecting you to predict the presidential election coming up, let alone what people might do. Obviously, on the Democratic side, most people presume the nomination will go to Hillary, who obviously is traditionally more hawkish than Obama, but a lot of people are on the Middle East. Do you think she would do anything dramatically different with regards to Iran? And then perhaps on the Republican side, obviously it's very hard to figure out who's going to win at this stage. Would they do something considerably different? And what, realistically speaking, could a new president do to change or alter this deal?
First of all, on the deal itself, as I said, there are inconsistencies and questionable parts of the deal that come from bad drafting. An administration that doesn't feel that they own the deal, and that'll be any administration after 2016, is going to be tougher on the Iranians than this administration is, for the normal reasons. If you helped create the baby, you own it, and you feel sort of sympathy for it. Whoever comes in 2017 is not going to feel that way. My experience working with Secretary Clinton is that she is very tough on these issues, and her worldview is such that what has happened from ISIS to Russia, intruding into Syria, to the refugee flow, to now ISIS apparently has figured out how to take down airplanes, this is going to be profoundly worrying to her, and she's going to be pretty tough. She will not...
It's okay, I think you're fine.
Is it still working? That's the key thing. Yeah. She will not... she will adhere to the agreement, but she will be pretty tough both in rhetoric and to some degree in behavior in implementing it. In terms of the Republicans coming in, they, all other than Ron Paul, take a pretty tough position on Iran. And so I think that it'll be not too different than Clinton's position. Several of them have said that they will get rid of this thing. The problem is, the assumption that they're making is they get rid of this thing and they reimpose the sanctions. As I've tried to argue here as strongly as I can, folks, you cannot impose sanctions on Iran internationally without the support of all these other countries. It's not there. There's one thing these countries dislike more than the United States in general, and I've spent most of my adult life out there with them, including our allies. It's the U.S. Congress and the Republican Party. And they're not going to follow orders from Washington to, step up and reimpose sanctions because we don't like the JCPOA. They like the JCPOA. Totally apart from the fact a lot of them like the trading with Iran that's going to be unleashed with this thing. And the Russians and the Chinese are the last people in the world who want to support one of our security endeavors in the Middle East. So it's just not going to happen.
Okay, and just to, again, for any of you out there, please feel free to write your questions on the cards, and my colleagues will collect them. Just maybe a question from the audience for you, Jonathan. Did anything significant happen in the recent meeting between Obama and Netanyahu? Or I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, look, absolutely it did. There's one thing I think that we're going to watch right now, and that is the memorandum of understanding between our two countries is up for review. The Israelis are trying to get another 10 years of assurances from the United States to make sure that it has what is known in Washington as QME. We love acronyms in Washington. QME is Qualitative Military Edge. And this means that Israel, no matter what happens in the region, no matter what weapons anyone gets, Israel, according to a promise made by the U.S. Congress, will always have weapons that can best its enemies. And so there is a shopping list that I am sure Bibi Netanyahu provided to the president, saying this is what we need in order to stay safe. This is what we need in order to combat a more aggressive Iran. And one of the things that we're watching right now, for those who try to calculate QME, is, well, what does it mean that all these other countries in the Middle East have also gotten a lot of these weapons? The Saudis have been buying weapons more than anyone else in the world for the last 2 years. And the Saudis, this may come as a surprise to you, don't necessarily want to celebrate Hanukkah with the Israelis this year. And so there's some tension there, right? That traditional American allies that are not exactly allies with Israel are bulking up on these weapons. And so it's a much more complicated space right now. And I know that some of these discussions are taking place between the White House and the Prime Minister's office in Jerusalem.
Okay, and Ambassador, maybe another one for you. This is asking, assuming that Iran complies with the terms of nuclear agreement and the sanctions are lifted in anticipated timetable, do you anticipate a shift in the regional balance of power in the next 5 years? And if so, what shifts do you foresee? Very easy question.
That has almost nothing to do with this agreement. That is, if the Iranians adhere to the agreement, they will not be a nuclear weapons power. So that's off the table for that period of time that they're doing that. The question of the shift in the balance of power in the region flows from what the Iranians do in the region and how we respond to it. Right now, I'm dissatisfied with that. As I said, I'm marginally less dissatisfied for the reasons I listed a few minutes ago than I was 2 months ago, but I remain dissatisfied. I'm pretty confident the next administration, whoever that may be, will take a tougher position on Iran's depredations in the region so that that shift may not occur. But this is a very dangerous moment in the region because the introduction of Russia into this thing as a quasi-ally of Iran's tends to serve, particularly as perceived by this White House, as a balance to us. And so we can't bully Iran, even if we wanted to, as easily as we could in the past. So it's a very dangerous moment.
Okay, and another question for you, Jonathan. And either of you can comment on any of these if you like. This audience member asked, many Democrats, including Jewish Democrats in Congress, feel perhaps alienated with Israel's recent actions regarding the Iran agreement and perhaps with Netanyahu coming to Congress. What can be done to reestablish a bipartisan relationship between Israel and the U.S.?
Look, it's a good question, and I think it's something that we're hearing a lot about in Washington right now. I will say that I think that the foundation between the United States and Israel is still relatively strong. It's not quite what it was, and I think, again, it's because I think the Israelis are looking on and wondering how is it that this could be considered a strategic relationship when the United States went out and struck a deal with a country that's sworn to Israel's destruction. It's shaken the foundations on some level, but I think that ultimately the Israelis are looking to try to paper over this for the next year, and then are expecting a new chapter in U.S.-Israel ties come basically late January next year, where they already know that they've got a very good relationship with Hillary Clinton. Her husband was the most popular American president in Israel's history. He was incredibly well loved, and I don't expect anybody thinks that it's going to be any different with Hillary. And then within the Republican field, I don't think that the Israelis have voiced a concern about the way that the candidates have talked about Israel and its security posture in the region. So I think we're talking about treading water for the next year, and then I think we're getting back to business.
Okay. Ambassador, maybe another one for you. This audience member asked, since the United Nations involvement precluded a better deal, and obviously you can give your perspective on that if that's the case or not, was the U.S. alternative perhaps the only way to go?
Was the what alternative?
Yeah, I think what they're trying to reference is basically if largely a lot of people would see the UN taking the lead perhaps wouldn't have gotten anywhere, would any deal, this deal or any other deal, had to have come through the U.S.?
Well, the doing it multilaterally did two things. First of all, it did this crushing sanctions, banking, and other pressure on Iran, which brought Iran to the table. We can discuss whether the administration did everything it could have with that leverage. I don't think it did. But at the end of the day, there was also a deal between us and the rest of the international community. First of all, one of the reasons we got so much support, not only from the Russians and Chinese, but also our European allies, was not simply that they have an underlying interest in Iran not having nuclear weapons. They are horrified of American use of military force for all kinds of reasons. That's been a traditional view, but it was heightened by us going into Iraq in 2003. So, in a way, even the Obama administration, they didn't know him as well as I do, felt that maybe they will go to war, or maybe Netanyahu would, and that would pull in the Americans. So one of the reasons that they went along with these sanctions was to preclude a unilateral military strike against Iran. So we had considerable leverage. But again, that leverage could have given us better terms on centrifuges and better terms perhaps on the percent of how many, whether it's 100 or kilos or 50 kilos and some other things, and I could have come up with a list of them at the technical level. It wouldn't have given us a condemnation of Iran's support for terrorism, because frankly we have a hell of a hard time getting the Europeans, we had a hell of a hard time getting the Europeans to even agree that Hezbollah is a terrorist organization, let alone the Russians and others. This is a very complicated area, and we were not going to get the international community to support our agenda on Iran beyond the nuclear account. That's simply the reality.
Okay, and again, I would just like to, apologize for the sake of time. I have about 40 great questions up here. We won't be able to get to all of them, but there's some excellent questions and a sign of a great and informed audience. I don't know if either of you prefers to address this, or perhaps you both would like to. Can you both address the potential strengths and weaknesses of the inspections arrangement under this deal? I mean, how realistic do you think it is, I guess? You want to go first?
Look, I mean, I'm not a technical guy. We have people at FDD who handle the technical issues a lot better. But look, I think there are a couple of things that are worth noting. One is that the possible military dimensions of the deal, the PMDs that the ambassador spoke of, is a huge issue that has, it's been swept under the rug. And so in order to really understand whether you're dealing with a country that has ambitions for a nuclear weapon, which of course we believe Iran is one of those countries, the fact that we've not gotten the Iranians to come clean on what they've done in the past is a really bad indicator of what we're going to get in the future. If you are if you're truly contrite about what you've done and you've come into this agreement in good faith, then of course you're going to come out here and say, look, we were doing this before, we were trying to get a nuke, but now we've decided not to, we're going to play by the rules from now on. That's not what we're getting from Iran. And so that's a huge gaping hole in the inspections regime. This is just inspecting the past. And then there's some other wild things about this, where Iran is able to take its own soil samples at the Parchin facility, right, where it can hand them over to the IAEA to have it inspected. I'm sorry, this is Iran, guys, right? We know that, Iran has this record of mendacity, this record of cheating. How do we expect the Iranians not to cheat? Now, if it's not here, it'll be somewhere else. But I think, look, in general, the way that this is structured is incredibly flawed.
Everything you said is correct. It's still the most intrusive inspection regime, short of after we went in with 100,000 troops in 1991 into Iraq. That's the alternative. So again, This isn't an American inspection regime. It's an international agency's inspection regime. International agencies have a hard time dealing with this. My belief is, and I'm fully in accordance with Jonathan on this, that the Iranians will cheat on this. The one thing, I mentioned a minute ago, there was a short list of things or a long list of things I would have liked to see us do in this negotiation. I think the PMD is a very important one for two reasons. First of all, as he says, it is important to know what kind of research they're doing. We have a lot of intelligence on it, but we don't have everything. Secondly, it would have pushed them to essentially admit to having done something wrong. There's nothing in this agreement that has Iran admitting it has done anything wrong, although we know they were pursuing weaponization, and we know that they were violating the Natran site initially, the Fodro site, and a dozen other things. They were violating their NPT commitments, and they're not even having to admit that. That's a problem, because if we could have gotten them to admit it, and I think on the margins we might have, and we might have had international support for that because it's nuclear, it's not terrorism or money laundering, we would be in a better position with our allies in the region, because they want to see Iran named and shamed.
Okay, and maybe a last, again, another easy question to finish on, and maybe I'll start with you, Jonathan, but maybe if you both could answer the question. For outside of Democratic and Republican politicians on both sides, a lot of Americans, for understandable reasons, like something you mentioned in your opening remarks, do have a degree of war fatigue. Obviously, with our significant losses and efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan, but even perhaps beyond that, some people would mention, well, whether it's realistic or not, the idea of the pivot to Asia. And also that perhaps 5-10 years ago, before the Arab Spring and before the Middle East was so fragmented, if we actually had an Israeli-Palestinian peace deal, that might have had a significant impact in the region, or the recruiting of new terrorists. Perhaps that's less important now. And I guess lastly, kind of for the Houston audience, people might say, every year the United States imports less oil from the region, and with the help of fracking, but also with other discoveries and exports in other parts of the world. I know the region sets oil prices, which is largely, which is very important. But how would each of you explain to kind of not just politicians, but the American public, why the U.S. should stay so involved in the region? And maybe if you want to particularly take Israel, and if you want to take the region in general, or both, you can address both of it. And Jonathan, you want to start?
Look, I think that there is an argument to be made that we need to get out of the Middle East. But that doesn't mean that we need to get out of all of the Middle East. And it also means that we can't get out of the Middle East right now just because we want to. The way I would put it is that, in the Middle East, you don't get to choose your enemies. Your enemies choose you. And we have seen this time and again, that enemies have arisen in the Middle East, and we've had to confront them. Sometimes it's been Israel confronting them, sometimes it's been us. But these are people who, there's a dangerous ideology that needs to be neutralized. Now, there are lots of different ways to describe this ideology, and most of them don't play well on NPR. But let me put it this way. It's called militant Islam, radical Islam, Islamism, whatever the word is. This is something that we are going to need to tackle. This is the great war of I think, of our lifetimes. And until that war is won, I don't think we can leave the Middle East. It has nothing to do with whether a peace agreement is struck between the Palestinians and Israelis. I don't even think at this point that it has much to do with the price of oil. This is an ideological battle. This is an ideology that is challenging our own, and I think we're having a very hard time in this country grappling with it. I think that in the Bush years, we saw an administration that wanted to do too much, that we were hyper-aggressive, trying to topple dictators and promote democracy around the world. And now we see an administration that is afraid of doing too much. In fact, we're doing too little. And what we've seen is mass carnage in both cases. Devastation in both cases. We're going to need to figure out how to strike that middle ground. This is what I hope to see in the presidential elections of 2015 going into the 2016, that we start to, or 2016 going into 2017, that we find that person who can strike that middle ground, and then ultimately, hopefully, having won the battle, be able to leave the Middle East in good faith.
Ambassador, would you like to
Jonathan's absolutely on target. President Obama, in the best sentence he said in his 7 years about the Middle East, the UN in 2013 listed 4 vital interests we have in the Middle East, and these have been traditional since, with some modifications, since 1945. Flow of hydrocarbons, I'll come back to that. combating terror. Jonathan summed up why that's so important, but just think of the Russian airplane over the Sinai the other day. Taking care of our allies and friends, and stopping the spread of weapons of mass destruction. Those are really important concerns. In terms of oil, again, even the most optimistic predictions still peg our imports of oil as dropping not much below 1/3 of what we consume, which is about 20 million barrels a day, maybe 18 million barrels a day now. So we're still going to be importing some millions of barrels of oil. But more importantly, the price of the oil you pay at the gas pump, whether it's produced in the United States or anywhere else in the world, short of price controls, and that's something nobody wants in America, is determined by the global supply and demand, which is mainly a factor of what's happening in the Middle East, either Saudi decisions or war and turmoil and the closing of the straits. So that impacts us directly. Moreover, even if we could separate ourselves, much of our wealth in these days comes from trade with partners in Europe and Asia. They don't have oil. They rely on it from the Middle East. So it's or from Russia, and God knows that's not a stable supplier of anything. So that's the predicament we're in with oil. Now, in terms of the American people, I'm glad you raised that, and I'm glad I have these statistics with me. And this is from your fellow organization, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, which, while I'm sure not as good as the Houston one, actually does really good polling. And they've been polling for a long time. And across parties, majorities favor an active U.S. role in world affairs. This is a poll just out a month ago. The highest it was in many years was 79% for a strong role in world affairs for Republicans back in 1974, and Democrats for 75%. Now, Democrats and Republicans are almost tied at 69 and 67%, so it's almost back up there. And in terms of, do you consider Islamic fundamentalism, and they use the I word, Jonathan will be happy, do you consider Islamic fundamentalism a critical threat, an important but not critical threat, or not an important threat? Well, the percent of people who consider it a critical threat is 66% among Republicans and 48% among Democrats. Forget about the rest of the people, of course, consider it an important threat, but that's up almost as high as it was right after 2002. Now, I'm not going to go out and advocate another Iraq mobilization with 150,000 American troops. I've seen that movie. I've been part of it, and it didn't work then. It won't work again. But we are miles and miles away from that. We used different rules of engagement when we sent our troops in with Kurds to do that raid in Hawija, where we rescued 70 people facing certain death, and it worked. We lost one man, and that's a tragedy, but those are, believe me, low casualties by the wars I've been involved in. We went into Kunduz, and we liberated a city of 2 million people from the hold of the Taliban in less than 4 days. Now, again, there was a tragedy. We hit a hospital in the process, but the Afghan people and the people of Kunduz are really delighted that we did that. There are much more we can do with limited military exposure, limited casualties, to push back these devils. We're going to do it either in this administration, or believe me, the next administration will do it, because by that time it won't have any choice.
Okay, and I just wanted to thank Ambassador Jeffrey and Jonathan Chandler so much. Excellent program.